So we're here today talking to artist Eliza about her painting practice and about home and landscape and connecting to land. So Eliza, could we just get you to start by telling us a little bit about your art practice?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, I feel like I've sort of always been an artist, and I've also always been an environmentalist. And so to me, creating and sharing the wonders of the natural world have always been really key in my artwork.
Yeah.
And so this project here, this being WORA, this is my bush block, grassy creek-lined woodland in WORA, central Victoria. And so I bought this nearly 20 years ago, just after I moved to Castlemaine. And it sort of has become really my life work. So quite often I've depicted images of this area in some of my paintings. And also I've expanded, as you know from my artwork, when I'm speaking a lot about WORA country, looking really at the local landscape around Castlemaine, central Victoria area, and the homelands of the WORA Aboriginal Nation. So I've woven the various strands and interests together. So there's the geology, the ecology, the culture, with the living environment and the living landscape. So I've done a lot of work out here environmentally.
Yeah.
I kind of hand weed my little woodland and wetland.
Wow.
It's massive.
So you said nearly 30 acres, is that right?
Yeah, 29 acres.
29 acres, and you're hand weeding what, invasive?
Yeah, the invasive weeds,
Yeah.
and particularly in the central area, probably nearly an acre of the pastoral grasses. So the invasive invasive grasses, which then actually reveals and enables the native grasses to thrive. And because at the beginning of getting this place, I've put a nature covenant and all sorts of land for wildlife, trust for nature, land care. I've had this really strong focus, and to me it weaves in perfectly with my artwork. So yeah, that's...
So with the so you talked a lot about the WORA, sort of telling those stories and stuff. Do you have an Indigenous background? Are you Indigenous?
No.
So how is that? This is at the crux of what I'm exploring really, is how do we connect to those stories? What's the relevance of them for us, and how do we feel at home? How is that relationship? Obviously it was a close one, so that's interesting. So tell me about that.
Yeah, well, since being here, I've actually realised, and since doing a lot of my historical research, I've realised that there's a chance, and I need to finish my research, that my father's great uncle may have been one of the very early land invaders on Ravenswood, Mount Alexander, which actually, those as pastoral properties, was adjacent to Muckleford, which was originally quite a large pastoral holding.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting because ever since I've been in Castlemaine, which is 20 years, I've felt absolutely glued here, magnetised. A few times I've thought, I'll go and do other things, but it always draws me back.
Wow.
And it's sort of crazy that I haven't completed this ancestry.com work to actually figure out if it was my father's great uncle, who was an early land invader from 1843.
Wow. So when you came up here 20 years ago, where were you coming from?
Well, I'd grown up in Canberra, and then I'd moved to Sydney and been to art school, and then I moved to Melbourne and went to uni, and then in 1999 I moved to Castlemaine.
And what was it, do you know, at that time? What made you choose this, or is this part of the magnetism?
Well, I always knew from when I was a teenager that I would live in a country town.
Okay.
And originally Braidwood in New South Wales was a strong call.
Yeah.
But then when I was in Melbourne and found Castlemaine,
Yeah.
and it just seemed a natural place.
Does it remind you of Braidwood and surrounding Canberra areas?
Yeah.
There is a real similarity.
A
isn't
lot.
Mm.
Yep, inland,
Real
freshwater
familiarity.
country.
Yeah.
Yep. And even the whole nature of it, strangely enough, both of them were gold towns.
Yeah.
But the bit that most people forget is that they were first. And even the whole nature of it, strangely enough, both of them were gold towns.
Yeah.
But the bit that most people forget is that they were first pastoral invasion.
Yes.
It was 15 years at least of pastoral invasion before they discovered the gold.
So I was reading this on your website about that sort of, you were tracing it back to sort of 1835-ish.
Yep.
That was really a key moment.
Turning point.
Yep, of taking over these areas.
Yep.
Is that, so that's key in your work, isn't it?
Yep.
That it's sort of the precursor to the gold era.
Yes.
And that people have sort of
completely
missed.
overlooked it.
This is the pastoral period that you're talking about.
Yeah. So it was much earlier, naturally, in New South Wales.
Yeah.
And interestingly, my fascination in Major Mitchell links very strongly with Braidwood and those areas, because he visited those places in, the early 1800s.
Right.
And that was very much a pastoral invasion.
So tell us about Major Mitchell. He was
the Surveyor General in New South Wales. He was Scottish, and there's a big backstory on him. But he came in 1827 to Sydney, and like I say, was the chief surveyor of land. But he did a few really big expeditions. And in 2010, Tricky Dog and I followed Major Mitchell's one of his first big expeditions from 1836, which went out from sort of Orange, out through central New South Wales, and then down extensively through Victoria, and right here through Castlemaine and this region. Yeah. And the interesting thing with Mitchell is that there's so much about this man. He was a scientist, a linguist, an artist, a surveyor. He was so many things. He was Enlightenment man, a real bastard. But
was he?
yes,
Yeah.
Well, he was one of the ones who basically said, "Come on down, guys. The land is open and available for civilization." And
which reflected the overall
thinking
philosophy of the whole
the whole imperial narrative
yes.
was exactly that.
Yeah.
But he was interesting, and I think particularly that he could speak many European languages. And when you've learned a few languages, it makes it much easier to understand other languages, to hear them. And he always travelled with guides, Indigenous guides, and I'm sure that he was picking up a lot of language and getting a lot of more of the nuance than he actually more than he reveals, because he was very fascinated by the Aboriginal people and their place names. So there's a lot of Aboriginal place names were actually recorded by Major Mitchell, as were a lot of names given from European and particularly Scottish towns, Dunkeld and Hamilton and Castlemaine. Well, actually, Castlemaine was Irish.
Irish, that's right, yes.
It was a bit later.
Yes.
But lots of the Grampians
Yes.
and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So Mitchell had very open eyes for finding new pastoral lands for the colony.
And for your work, that's critical because that is a key moment of dispossession, is that?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep. And that denial, that wiping aside, that changing of the narrative, that stealing of everything. And there's a lot more I need to write about all of that, because I've looked at it from very much a sort of post-colonial, feminist, postmodern sort of viewpoint. And I think the feminist thing is actually really important too, because it's very easy to look at their masculine language, to look through that and read between the lines to comprehend it in a different way. And yeah, to bring a new take and a fresh narrative.
So what does that history do to you? So you're here now, this is the land you know that you feel at home here, this is your place and everything. What does that history, how does that inform how you connect to it?
A great sense of responsibility to try to reimagine and recreate some of the pre-colonial.
Yeah.
Because most people, our memories are very, very short, and most people only know it and understand it in terms of what they've seen and experienced. There was one man who was 80, who was born and bred in Castlemaine, and when he saw my big painting, which shows the waterways and the ecology and depicts a more pre-colonial landscape, including the Aboriginal villages, so I put, where we have our townships, I place Aboriginal villages. And this lovely man said, I've never seen the landscape in that way. I never realised there was so much water here, and so many waterways and creeks.
I did notice that with your work. Waterways are really big, aren't they?
Yeah, and that I've referenced an 1853 map of this region that actually shows these incredibly abundant waterways and springs, and it also shows the initial pastoral huts, so the main homestead and the outstations, and I think almost certainly that those would have been the Aboriginal villages because they were on the best water in the best locations, and it also meant that when they came to plant a garden they could just pop the seeds in the soil and they grew. And we really, these stories have not been told to reimagine how they actually, you know, the landscape as they found it, saying created by the hand of nature, stealing it and creating their own version so quickly, so easily. So this particular map, it's called the Selwyn map from 1853, and it's incredibly detailed and very, very beautiful. I'll have to show you sometime because it helps me, it really helps inform me of what this area was like, combined with Major Mitchell's descriptions.
So the paintings that you do, which are really beautiful, I love your paintings, are they part of the reimagining? Is that what you're doing? Yeah. So would
Absolutely.
you see them, is the function of those paintings, I mean it probably has many, but for you does it feel more like it's making sense of where you are, or is it like educating other people?
Absolutely both.
Both, yeah.
Absolutely both. It's been a really interesting journey and process for myself to combine all the layers of knowledge which I've been gaining and gathering and bring them together in a fresh narrative.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really interesting journey for myself, but also very much as an educational thing, a process to share that knowledge. And it's, the results have been amazing. Everybody loves it. They love to share that reimagining and that travelling through space and time.
But there is a lot of research with your work. So, and you're talking about geological interests. So how do you go about?
Yeah, I combine the geology, the ecology, the historical narrative, the primary source documents, and then the works of people like Bill Gamage, Bruce Pascoe. There's so many layers and a lot of maps. Maps are fantastically interesting for narrative. So I combine all of those into a reimagining. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's pretty exciting work. But the other thing too is that given that I don't get down to Melbourne very much, whenever I find a really interesting research reference, I go online on Abe Books and I buy the book. So I've actually got this extraordinary reference library myself. And I just am longing to find a week or a month to immerse.
Yes.
But I'm always so busy with activism and projects, and
Right.
but one day I'll just lock the gate and I'll spend the time.
You must have a good room, library dedication. in your
Yeah,
house.
my studio's got
Your
some
studio,
books,
yeah.
some shelves of books, and lots of articles and things. So if I was thinking next year of maybe doing an MA, and then I thought, no, that's just going to add pressure. I think I'm just going to start sifting through my documentation, and I might go back to uni second semester next year.
Yeah.
When you say go back, you mean go back to do a master's, or are you in the middle of something that you?
Yeah, I'll go back and do a master's.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
through La Trobe Uni.
Yeah.
Mm.
So obviously you're telling the history and reimagining things. I'm interested in how we do that, and something that I experience is I'm anxious about, am I allowed to? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it okay? What can I say? What can't I say? I have a lot of anxiety around it all.
Yeah.
I feel like you're not feeling that. You're just telling the stories, which is great. How did you reach that point, or what?
Well, I think I've always been a bit of a free thinker.
Yeah.
And and I also had an alternative education where on many levels I'm really cross about that, because we didn't develop academic discipline,
Yeah.
but I engaged in a lot of different variety of thought,
Yeah.
and also part of what we did, this was an alternative school in the 70s in Canberra,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of anti-apartheid and land rights and sovereignty, and a lot of Aboriginal protests and things we went to. And so it's always been part of my thinking and part of my lexicon.
Yeah.
And very early I experienced, well, I've always spent time in the bush,
Yeah.
and so I suppose I've been comfortable in that space. I've always known to watch for snakes. I've always been aware of fire. I've understood land degradation. I've understood drought. I've kind of engaged in the elements, but also more generally with gathering that information and feeling good about telling that story, is that I believe in education
Yeah.
as a way of actually getting to find some way of creating environmental change, because unless people are educated and unless they understand how dramatically this land's been transformed and the process that it was transformed, we remain in ignorance and denial.
Yes, I think you're right.
That until people understand what this place was like, they won't understand climate change and what we need to work towards for the future. So this is going to be a climate change refuge. So it's so important to recognise what's here. And even this morning, a friend of mine, Paul Foreman, who's an amazing ecologist, he and I are working to build up a really big ecological project around here. And we went into the paddock just to the north, and there's an exquisite wetland.
Really?
Yeah, and Paul, who knows all about these things, has said it potentially is a wetland of national or at least state significance for the plants that
it's got.
are present.
So what's the
exciting.
project? Can you talk about it, or?
Yeah, well, we're going to work with Landcare, Connecting Country, Trust for Nature, a variety of organisations, but we're working towards rehabilitating the landscape and the hydrology, because one of the things which is really a big problem around here is that actually a lot of this is residue from the gold mines, and gold mining rather.
So is that the soil you mean?
This is potentially sludge.
Right. So
Yeah.
does that explain aspects of the landscape around here?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So the creek just to the north of here is the Porcupine Creek,
Yeah.
and that flows from out the back of Malden.
Yeah.
And then just to the north here, it meets the Muckleford Creek, which flows from about probably 10, 15, 20 k's up that way.
Right.
And this little creek line here is actually the Muckleford Creek. But in the nearly 20 years I've been here, I've only seen it flow, I think it's 6 times now.
But presumably it was flowing a lot more.
Yeah. A friend of mine who lives further down in Muckleford, he's about 70 now. He was born and bred in Muckleford and actually of a couple of generations. He said that when he was a child, this creek flowed 12 months of the year.
I've heard this from a lot of people.
And then by the
That's not long ago, is it?
by the 1980s, it started to flow 6 months of the year.
Yeah.
And then with the drought of 83, 84, since then, and it's probably because a lot more people have been putting in bores and
They're
dams,
draining from these.
they steal all of the water. So, and it's also very silted and clogged up. So, amazingly enough, and this is visible from my paintings, this is a tributary to the Murray-Darling Basin.
Oh.
So it actually flows from the north down to the south. It meets the Loddon River just before Newstead, and then the Loddon flows all the way north to the Murray at Kerrang. And virtually nobody knows that. It's something I only learnt that from doing my paintings. I put all that together. I've spoken with all sorts of people who are engaged in this field, NCCMA, all sorts of stuff. They didn't put it
They
together.
didn't figure it out. So this is how art has led to illumination.
Yes.
They're very practical.
Yeah.
As well as obviously deeper significant.
Yeah, and spoken in a knowledge shared in a different format. It's not academic. It's not black and white. It's engaging and it's colourful and it's multidisciplinary.
So do you think that the painting that you do, the actual act of painting, does that in and of itself connect you to the landscape? Yeah.
Yeah. At one stage, it was amazing. I'd been reading about John Hepburn, who was one of the very early pastoral invaders here in 1837. And then I was painting and I was listening to Bruce Pascoe on my podcast, and I was painting the Hepburn area, and I suddenly had these great amazing thoughts about John Hepburn's words from a book called Letters of Victorian Pioneers, and he was saying, "Of the natives I know little, they keep a very wide berth of my place." And I'd always thought that was because he had all his highly well-armed convict shepherd hut keepers. But then I started to think, he would have taken an abandoned village. But it was also from another conversation I'd had with Auntie Kath, who had been saying that up to 2/3 of the populations of Aboriginal people had been decimated by the smallpox, even before Major Mitchell came through.
Oh, really?
So it's putting all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together and saying, okay, so the Indigenous people had been probably decimated, which means their main villages would have been abandoned. And then the pastoral invader comes, and what's the first place they're going to take up is that abandoned village, because they know the local Indigenous people aren't going there anymore. So they've almost got this protective space around them, backed up by their guns
Guns, germs,
and steel. Yeah.
Very effective, isn't it?
And so this layering of information with Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage and Major Mitchell and John Hepburn and Auntie Kath, and then my own journeying and adventuring, and then painting Hepburn.
And the painting, sorry to jump in, but the painting, I'm guessing that creates an intense intimacy for you with the detail. Is that part of what you're doing when you're painting something?
It's how it's my visual narrative. Because I struggle a bit with writing the words, and I know that I really just need to get out my iPhone and record the words, get it to auto text, and then go back and correct. So I've got already a lot of chapters started with lots of big ideas, but now I need to fill in the detail, and that's what I'm able to do with my painting. and my drawing and my photography and
Mm.
create that visual narrative.
Do you think so what's the advantage of translating that into language, into words?
Because a lot of people still need words to help describe the images.
Yeah.
Well, and you're accessing the information through words as well, aren't you? So words are
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it oils that you're using or?
No, acrylic.
Acrylic.
on
Is there
canvas.
something about that why choose painting as opposed to, is it just that that's who you are, or is there something specific about creating a textural, colourful, visual
Yeah.
product? Have you thought about that?
I initially was a printmaker and did printmaking at art school, and painting as a minor. But I think I've found that, and particularly acrylic paint, I like the medium because it's not very toxic and it's not very smelly.
Yeah.
I love painting in oils, but two things, it's a bit stinky
Yeah.
and it's a bit slow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I love working in gouache and many
Yes.
other mediums too,
Yeah.
but acrylic on canvas seems to work for me.
Yeah.
And do you paint mostly in your studio, or do you paint here sometimes?
I need to paint here more often, but yeah, mainly I paint in my studio
Yeah.
because I can do it any time of day or night.
Yeah. And do you think that process of, so your studio is at home? At the
In my
that
house,
you live in?
yeah.
But you chose this when we said, this was the first place you mentioned when I said choose somewhere that's home. So does this
Yeah.
feel equally home or more home than
Equally home.
equally home?
Yeah.
And to your-
And I absolutely and I've got a little camp kitchen up the top, and I'm going to create another little camp kitchen down here.
Yeah.
And now I've got my little caravan here. It just makes it easy. I come out, I pop the lid, and I can stay, and yeah, it's pretty special.
But the studio in particular, that's in town in Castlemaine, that also you have a strong bond to that
Yeah.
spot.
Well, it's interesting because I've lived in about 4 houses in Castlemaine, and I keep sort of gradually getting closer and closer to the heart of Castlemaine. And I love being in that town. I feel like it does feel like a village, and I do want people to understand that would have been, I'm absolutely certain, a very significant Aboriginal village. And I think another layer of trying to comprehend a more embracing Aboriginal, Indigenous story is to understand that there were significant permanent villages, and there were also many seasonal campsites. And living here over 30, 40, 50,000 years, of course they were moving around. But I think that Castlemaine, that little area there, would have been a very significant village because it had 2 major waterways, the Barkus Creek and the Forest Creek, with all the tributary waterways. We'll never really know how many, correctly what the populations were of these areas, because, like I say, the populations were decimated very, very early, well in advance of Mitchell and the original pastoral invaders.
Who came through before Mitchell?
Sorry?
Who came through before Mitchell?
Nobody.
So how did the small... Oh, it started and just spread.
It travelled.
Yeah.
Yep. And the imperial invaders, when they came to Sydney, they knew very clearly what they were doing.
Oh, right.
There's no doubt.
Okay.
Well, some of my research lately has been really making a strong connection between the East India Company and the invasion of Australia.
What's the connection?
The connection is that a lot of the ships, therefore the captains and the crews and the navigators, a lot of those people had been involved with the East India Company. An interesting book I bought recently about a ship called the Calcutta, which came to Australia in 1803-04, had been a recommissioned East India Company ship, and it was the ship which came down to Sorrento and attempted to establish a outpost at Sorrento, but they said they couldn't manage it because there wasn't enough water. Well, my theory is that there was actually probably too many Aboriginal people here still. So that's when they sailed on to Tasmania.
Oh.
Yeah. And then they took all of Tasmania. Much easier. It was contained. And they finished that off with the Black Line, which was where George Augustus Robinson was involved with a lot of Indigenous Aboriginal people, like Tuganini and many others, to round up the remaining Aboriginal people and take them to the islands, with the story that they were going to only be taken there temporarily for safety, and then would be able to come home. And then, so that was all through the 1830s that they took Tasmania, and an extraordinary historian called James Boyce has written really 2 brilliant books, one of them about Tasmania, and then the other one called 1835, about the founding and conquest of Melbourne. And he calls it the fastest land grab in history. That when the overlanders and the pastoralists came flooding into Victoria, it was so fast. It was so brutal, and it was so hidden. And one of the areas that I'm researching a lot at the moment is George Augustus Robinson, the Chief Protector of Aborigines.
No protection.
No, he was here as an emissary, you know, somebody on behalf of the government to basically help smooth the dying pillow. He was not here to protect the Aboriginal people.
To bring it back to your story, so Canberra, were you on the outskirts, or I mean, Canberra's very bushy,
Yeah.
obviously. As
We were in Deakin,
Oh yeah,
but we backed into bushland.
yeah, beautiful area.
Yeah.
Um,
And then also my dad had a bush block just
Right.
outside Canberra when we were
near
kids.
Braidwood area, or
Part way towards, it was more towards Captain's Flat.
right? Yeah,
And
I'm from Canberra. So
oh really?
yeah. And I get a strong sense of familiarity in this area. Is that so for you? Can we talk about feelings of being at home? So this has it for you here.
Yep.
So particularly here in Walmart, you think?
In central Victoria.
Central Vic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's the climate.
it's the climate. It's very,
I mean, I've loved living in Sydney and Melbourne, being near the coast.
yeah,
But I'm an inland girl.
yeah, the drier. Yeah.
I can cope with this really easily.
Yeah.
I love this environment. The cold and dry, the hot and dry.
yeah.
And then the seasonal, very beautiful seasons.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah.
what do you think it is about? Do you think for you then it's a sort of a personal story that allows you to connect to this area, or do you think it's something bigger than that, or is it a choice, or is it
Definitely a choice.
there's a choice too?
Yeah.
Okay.
I could sort of live anywhere,
Could you? Yeah.
anywhere in the world. Yeah, pretty well. I've got a British passport and a Australian passport, and I, you know, child free and single, and
Yeah.
could really, if I wanted to, pack up and move anywhere in the world.
What do you feel rooted here for the foreseeable future?
Yeah.
And if so, how does that take place? Do you think is it history for you, or
It's feeling a very strong desire to really keep working on telling the story, you know, developing the narrative, and I also really want to work much more closely with the Jajaran people,
okay?
because I do recognise I've been engaged but not enough. You know, always involved and engaged, but
There's more.
there's so much more. Yeah. And yeah, in this whole area. And then when I discovered this potential connection with Ravenswood Mount Alexander, it's like, oh my God, maybe it is, you know, my ancestors have lived on this land for a long time. And I've been, because I really feel like I'm magnetised to it.
So
It's
is that
energetically connected.
right? Which is an amazing description of a connection to an area, and also of it being about a sort of, would you say, a sort of almost like there's a mythology within your family history as well.
Although those stories weren't spoken, our family didn't.
Right. Okay, so
It's really interesting that our family were not the kind of family that sat around with Nana and Grandpa and shared the stories. We didn't see much of them, and my nana and grandpa had actually moved to Sydney by the time we got back to Australia, or by the time my parents came back to Australia. And they didn't move back to Melbourne, they moved to Canberra. So there's been a very fragmented, as is our kind of culture, really.
Yeah, that's a key thing, isn't it?
A lot of our culture, we're not deeply connected, so it's easy to up and move. And yet somehow we sometimes go back to where it all began.
No, I was going to say, do you think that urge to deeply connect is like a human thing? Do you think that's in us? Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I love so much about Castlemaine, it's more like a village than anything.
It also speaks to the horror, really, of what you're talking about in the 1800s in particular.
Yep.
Because of that energetic style connection to place and how fundamental, it's fundamental.
Yep. And wanting to help heal. Heal the land and heal the culture. And sort of re-expose or expose some of the lost stories.
Yeah. And stories being critical too. You've mentioned that. There's something about storytelling.
Yeah.
Which your art does, it's very, like you said, narrative, use the word narrative, it's strongly narrative based, you're painting.
Yeah. And particularly going back to the early narratives, and whether it's Major Mitchell's journals, George Augustus Robinson's journals, an amazing book, The Letters of Victorian Pioneers, which was gathered by Governor Latrobe in the 1850s. And he put out to a lot of the early land invaders or pastoralists or squatters that for them to tell their story of their experience as an early pastoralist. And naturally the narratives are so woven in a form as to, to totally diss Indigenous presence, populations, behaviour.
So they were uniform? Did you find that they were all pretty haughty in their appreciation of what they were doing and the land?
Yes.
Yeah.
And a very shared sort of patriarchal imperial narrative. So it's really worth a good read, that one. And then there's another one which is called Recollections of Squatting in Victoria by Edward Micklethwaite Kerr, and it's amazing. It's also very locally based, just sort of on the edge of Djajaran country, over towards it's Karagarag, Tongala, up to the Moira, on the Murray, and it's very fascinating because it was written in the 1880s, but of his recollections of his experiences in the 1830s and 40s. So actually I think it was written in the 1860s and published in the 1880s, but there's a whole narrative around that that's extraordinary. And it really describes in pretty terrifying terms the dispossession, the process of dispossession. And what I started to realise was that by the time of the gold rush, that dispossession was a little bit done and dusted. So let's get on with the next beautiful heroic narrative of gold.
Yeah.
And then we had bushrangers, and then we had squatters, or that, all of these, and then we had the Great Wars, and it's all male, just narrative. So sometimes I'm looking more now at also any female narrative I can find. They're really fascinating. The letters of Rachel Henning, or some of the early women's recordings of pioneer life.
And do you get differences coming through when you listen to women's voices? You do?
Yep.
And does it capture some of that, keep coming back to horror, but like the grief-inducing process of dispossession? Does that come through at all? Or
Well, I think the interesting thing is that by the time they were bringing the women out here, a lot of that really brutal stuff had probably occurred. But there was something I was reading, I can't think of the title of the actual book. It was something about pioneering. the Aboriginal people were very fascinated by the children. And then I started to think, well, the initial frontier would have been very, very male. Very few white women. There would have been Aboriginal women stolen. And the horrors of those stories are barely imaginable. But it suddenly occurred to me that when things were beginning to settle and they'd build a little cottage and whatever, they'd bring the women, and then there'd be the children. And so I try and think about that land invasion from an Indigenous perspective as well, of what that must have been like, trying to interpret these men with their massive animals and the guns and the chains and the technology and that whole process. And then that next stage when the women started to be present and their take on it and their descriptions. So it's weaving all these different
There's so much
realms.
there. Yeah.
So much there.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about domestic spaces, whether that is important to you at this point with what you're doing? Like your house, I know your studio's there, but is the house itself an important grounding space and an enduring one possibly, or is that less important given that you've got what you've got here?
Well, I love my house. I love my garden. I've got really great veggies and wicking beds and lots of that going on. So it's really special.
Okay.
But also I love having my camp kitchen and my fires, and we cook up amazing feasts out here. I feel
the best of both,
incredibly fortunate. Yeah. And I love camping. I really just think that we spend far too much time indoors in Australia, or in the world really. So my house has got some good sort of indoor-outdoor spaces, but I love coming here and, dressing correctly and
enjoying
and just loving being in nature.
I think we're just about
that's
there.
it,
I reckon we've covered everything we need to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Incredibly interesting. So much to think about.
Terribly interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you both
Thank
too.
you.